having contacted her many times because of her very busy schedule also. She's flying off to Singapore also. There will be another London, Singapore. And then in the context of the Biennales, right, that we have been receiving notices from the Facebook and about the visual arts Biennale and that of the architecture Biennale. We thought of inviting Ms. Marian to revisit those in the context of the Philippine participation. I guess all of you already know Ms. Marian Pastor Roces. She is the founder of Tao Management, one of the organizations in the Philippines which takes charge of conceptualizing exhibitions and museums. One of the museums for which Ms. Marian has conceptualized and established is the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design, and we'd like to invite you to that when we open the exhibition on the 18th. But enough of MCAD, we will now listen to Ms. Marian.
I'd like to thank you for catching me. It was quite a feat. I like being a little bit of a shadow. I don't know the audience. I can't really see except my two cousins over there. So they're my cousins. And I actually don't know how to pitch it in terms of language. So I guess I will just begin with a bit of an apology. The first part is a reading. So the language is a language for written, published work. And so it's a bit dense. So I'll annotate that. But I do have another set of pages here, which is not from that essay, which I, no. Is it possible for me to just slip this in? I'll keep chattering. The other part is is several things. It's an update. It's a rethinking, and I'll tell you about what happens to an essay after 10 years. The essay that I am referring to, which I'm rethinking today, is called Crystal Palace Exhibitions, and it was published in 2006. The title of the essay I am referring to is Crystal Palace Exhibitions. It was written for an audience of specialists in art, and it has nothing to do with the Philippines. Yayi knows that most of my written work has nothing to do with the Philippines, so I hope you bear with me. It was written and published in 2006 and then republished in 2010. In 2006, it was part of a collection of essays in a book called Over Here, which was edited by Jean Fisher and Gerardo Mosquera, and published by the MIT Press. The second time it was published in 2010, it was in the Biennale Reader, which was put out by Bergen Kunsthal. So it slips into that strange place where essays internal to art goes, which is a bit of a limbo where nobody knows that it exists. So I just thought that since there's some talk these days about Biennales, that it may bear some thinking about. The Crystal Palace that I am referring to is the big one, the 1851, which had a huge number of variations and copies all over the world. It's the same business as the Palacio Cristal in Madrid. There was one in Melbourne. There's one all over the place. I believe the Philadelphia one was also. So it belongs to a period of empire. I should say imperialism because I'm going to distinguish between empire and imperialism later. So the Crystal Palace is the one that Prince Albert made for Queen Victoria. And I wrote this essay to make a connection between the first Universal Exposition in 1851 in London and the current Biennales. My argument has to do with plants. The architect of the Crystal Palace in England was a man named Joseph Paxton. I'm sure the architect over there knows that. And Joseph Paxton was a landscape architect at a time when the pastoral and all of that was happening in England. It was, of course, the apogee, the zenith of empire. That was Queen Victoria's time, and the project was Prince Albert's. And the Crystal Palace basically was an innovation in architecture, in the sense that, I'm addressing Dave over there, in a sense that crystal, glass, can be mounted to beat the entire skin of a building using steel, which was a very, it was a new way of using metal. And so there was this grace about all glass buildings using very thin steel members. And what it was in fact a hothouse. It was a glass house for plants. And so when the big 1851 Universal Exposition happened, the plant life that was brought from all over the country was essentially allowed to have a hot and temperate environment. So exotic species from all over the planet could thrive for the duration of the Universal Exposition. It was a statement about imperialism, it was a statement about owning the world. I need not go into that. That work has been done by more than 40 years of academic work. But I should just like to draw some insights from that fundamental thought that you can link the Universal Expositions to the current Biennales, at least that's my argument in this essay, via a meditation on the architecture for hothousing exotic species of plants. And I believe that the Biennales today are actually crystal palaces that hothouse exotic species of artists from all over the world. It seems like a rather essentialist position, but remember that this was a 10-year-old essay. This is a 10-year-old essay. I must have been younger at that time. But yes, I keep thinking that perhaps it shouldn't be that simple. But in 10 years, people have not picked up on the fact that the Crystal Palace was a hothouse for plants. Now, I did give another essay for the, I'd like to just refer to it once, this time. I did give another essay for the Power Institute in Sydney. It was a power lecture, and the title of the paper after this was Biennales and Biology. Now, what I was gnawing away, I was chewing on, as a result of this paper, was the fact that a lot of post-colonial tracts and essays was almost automatically using botanical metaphors like hybrid, which comes from people like, well, you know who the writers were. So I just thought that it didn't persist only in the exhibition format, it didn't exist only in the exposition format of bringing all sorts of species to one place. That's very powerful. The impact of it went on with language, because the metaphors were actually quite botanical, and we're still using words like hybrid today without really thinking twice about it. Those are really part of landscape and botany and biology. So, as you can see, I'm actually quite taken by such invisible threads that go through time. So may I just read to you the dense part of today's talk, which is from that first exhibition, from the essay of 2006. I started by saying that in the second half of the 19th century, a world at once overt and chimerical was conjured at the Universal Expositions by the imperial inventors. Natives from everywhere were stopped in their tracks, wonderstruck. And by native, I actually mean the London natives and the British natives, for they were spectators, but they were also clearly, though phantasmagorically, actors. I'm not the first one to say this, the viewer was an actor. In the reappearance of, I've earlier made reference to Minerva's shield. So in this has to do with mimesis as a whole discursive area. This is an astonishing machine. In the reappearance of the Crystal Palace, as the Industrial Revolution got underway, the shield of Minerva, the shield of mimesis, secured clarity of vision by bedazzlement. So it was a kind of clarity by being dazzled. It is the same shield that played with our reflections in our turn of the millennium international art events. It plays with and finally annuls time and space as inherited from the Enlightenment. Time and space circa or vintage the Enlightenment. Confoundingly, the Crystal Palace mirrors its future and its spatial dilation in today's global art shows, which glint with endless spectral reflections of 19th century imperialism. So the point that I made in the rest of this essay was that it actually predicted what's happening today. I will today actually try and modulate that position. Queen Victoria herself was bedazzled and understood this magic experience. This was London in 1851. And she wrote in her diary about being completely overjoyed because she could cast her eye as far as the eye could reach, projecting toward the outer limits of what is possible to be perceived or known at all. Thus, the success of the Crystal Palace as a sign of modern ambition. It materialized the glance as architecture. The transparent edifice produced the space of seeing, all places contrived to contain the uncontainable outside. Perhaps it is the spatial turn in postmodernism that makes the Crystal Palace form such grim, if not baleful reading, as this essay does read it. Certainly the phantom links between the Universal Expositions and the current Biennales and Triennales are fleshed out, as it were, only thinly, caricature-like and emptied of fulsome menace in temporal terms as lineage. Not so when they are regarded as similarly rarefied loci of where an aristocratic few exercise the will to order plurality on a very vast scale. Even if we grant the shift toward global art events as an attempt to outstare the colonizer's gaze, there are bedeviling risks of paralysis in spaces of context that mirror the spaces created by the forces contested. I am very nervous about using words like colonial without any knowledge of you, very little knowledge of people in the audience, because you might misconstrue me as one of those people who constantly voice out words like colonial and anti-colonial and all of that. It will take me until the end of this paper to convince you that I am by no means, only Yeye knows this, I think, that I do not use these words, but I need to use it in this essay. So just as a cautionary word, I'm not one of those. All right. I'm referring to Arthur Danto, the philosopher and art critic here. He bracketed, I'm jumping to a particular example, the Johannesburg Biennale, of which I was one of 60 curators. It was 60 curators. They invited curators, not artists. It was interesting. It was that moment when Nelson Mandela became president, only 1 year after. And that began the career of Okwe and Mazur in Johannesburg. 1993, with a concurrent edition of the oldest Biennale, that of Venice. Arthur Danto was the one who bracketed it together, I mean in writing, I'm not the one. Taking up the title of the Venice event, Ponte dell'Arte, if you remember that one, he briefly undertook a poetics of mapping. So I'm quoting Danto here. The Venice exhibition was to serve precisely the purposes of a compass. It was to orient the viewer to the artistic geography of the Biennale, and then to that of the world itself. So a map within a map. So the Biennale was a map within a map. That is his reading of the curator's project. He continued, a compass does not define the center of the world. After all, it orients its user wherever the user stands. So, these are the clever things that they write. Then he observed, so far as I can tell, Johannesburg was not one of the cardinal points on the Venice Biennale's curator Bonito Oliva's compass. He spotted a lacuna in the Biennale's liberal humanist encompassing of the earth. So I'm just quoting myself, I guess, and quoting Arthur Danto, who is also talking about the curator of the Venice Biennale of that day, of that time. To convey to you, or to give you a sense that a lot of mapping is concerned in Biennale making. In the same manner, I think that the Crystal Palace was obviously a mapping of the British Empire in 1851. Okay. It's a sort of thing that people do. The curators are constantly mapping. I think you will agree with me on this. The first thing that's done is to map who is what and who is doing what and what we can do if you put them all together in one place. It's cartography. All right. Then I quote Rem Koolhaas. It's very interesting at this point because he's talking about the London International Exhibition as triggering Manhattan's rise. So I thought this was, well, even when I wrote this 10 years ago, I thought this was an interesting moment for Rem Koolhaas to, this is a book of his. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this book. 2 years later, it has organized its own fair from 1851. After 1851, so 1853, New York organized its own fairs, taking a claim for its superiority in almost every respect over all other American cities. At this time, the city hardly extends north of 42nd Street, apart from the omnipresent grid. So all of you who are familiar with New York knows that it was much smaller in 1853. Except now Wall Street, except near Wall Street, it looks almost rural. Single houses scattered on the grass-covered blocks. The fair, this was the fair that New York mounted in response to the Great Exhibition of 1851, is marked by two colossal structures that completely overwhelm their surroundings, introducing a new scale to the island's skyline, which they dominate easily. The first is a vision of London's Crystal Palace. So New York kind of like reflected it back to Great Britain. So it just went on and on. So that is the end of my quote of Rem Koolhaas. Already a spatial discourse on the global in its prehistory and its textual formulations as universal. The Crystal Palace is supposed to be universal. Meaning to say, in the case of the Crystal Palace, it was the British Empire is the universe, or was the universe. The Crystal Palace expositions hothouse nothing less than the modern city. So the connection is to the creation of city. The spectacular space that materializes the power to command constructions of the global. The international art exhibitions of the last century have in large part performed the same imperative. Through the 2000 Shanghai Biennale, entitled The Spirit of Shanghai, you remember this was Hans Obrist and Hu Han Ru. For instance, the organizers set a course for the city to be the Venice of the East. As in Shanghai, the international art events organized in Guangzhou, Pontevedra, Lyon, Rotterdam, understood as assertions of metropolitan wherewithal aimed at having the cities shed their secondary status within their respective countries. So Guangzhou, as you know, is not Seoul. So by mounting a Biennale, it was a city creating itself, or making itself mount a higher platform. All right. So this essay now moved into the relationship of the great exhibitions, the notion of the universal, the imperial, and the creation of the modern city. We will keep going back to those coordinates: city, universal, biennale, garden architecture. All right. When you have a biennale, the artists are actually rather diminutive because it's so big. So if you have, it's like a World Expo, there's 120 countries, and so every single one of them tends to be small. So the literal diminution of the art object, so you can, all I'm trying to say here is that in terms of scale, you go into a gallery and you see an art object. You go to a museum and you see an art object. It's a building. When you go to a Biennale, you don't have that same relationship of scale, because the overwhelming experience is really the Biennale itself. So art itself is compacted around the modern bourgeois subject, whilst at the same time the enlargement of the promise of social change vested in capitalism and expressed in urban renewal. I'm talking about that pivotal point when it became the Venice Biennale, from the expos. Actually, the formulation of the Venice Biennale is the World Expo. It's the World Exposition. It's country pavilions. Extraordinary social significance was vested in change. The more sweeping, the more passionately charged. The passion persists in contemporary art practice, and its register is turned out very high indeed during the Biennales and triennials. It persists despite and because of the failure of capitalism and modern aesthetics to live up to the promise of social justice. Because the bourgeois domestication of art to the task of maintaining critical pressure in relation to onerous power cast as, pardon my eyes, cast as the onerous past remains an enduring aspect of modern subjectivity. The mythos that the World Exposition space holds radical possibilities continues to be compelling. And we know that every time there's a Biennale, it's supposed to be radical new ideas. It's a twist, isn't it? It's one hell of a twist, if you pardon my French. It pertains to no less than the structural shape of the modern subject. So I'm actually shifting here from the observation, not only of myself, but people like Graham Koolhaas and other and scholars, that the exposition produced the modern city, and I am now shifting it into the production of the modern self. Particularly as this form of life is sustained and validated in city-building work that itself preserves and reiterates the heroic aspirations of its 19th century precedent. The kind of utopian agenda that provides strong reasons for the holding of international exhibitions today tends to be expressed in a vocabulary reminiscent of the romantic imagination. Those of you who have been to this Biennales, I think will pick up the smell of romanticism with a capital R. The reference to reinvention, crossing over, discovery, exploration, radicalizing change, newness, freshness, these are all romantic utopian dreams. As though we didn't have the Second World War, as though we didn't have the Holocaust, etc., etc. The redefinition of the modern within modernity is constantly rehearsed in Biennales because such is the form. All right. Utopia appears no more endlessly malleable than in these events, but not necessarily as the postmodern strategy posited by Frederick Jameson, which requires incessant modification to address the quicksilver manipulations raked by power in the age of transnational capitalism, nor in the way Hal Foster, the critic, argues the possible recuperation of the political force of an insistently transmuting and returning avant-garde. I am quoting Foster now, quote, "There is this fundamental stake in art and academy, the preservation in an administered affirmative culture of spaces of critical debate and alternative vision. It is in this way that there is cause for doggedness." I've ended the quote. I think Foster would not use the word doggedness, so I ended the quote a little bit earlier. Indeed, the prowler's alertness to the operations of utopian imaginings that are too comfortably assimilable to what remains a 19th century technology of representation is indispensable. The universal exposition, the form of capitalist cultural infrastructure conceived to be an alternative space in the first place. It was supposed to be an alternative space where everyone, I think I'm going to make Hal Foster a little bit clearer to all of you by saying that he wants to preserve the avant-garde, the idea of radical change from the romantic idea that it came down to us from the universal expositions to the current international exhibitions via popular culture such as Disneyland, where, you know, when you go there, you begin to think it's a small world after all, and there are all these little, nice little representations of countries. It's Hal Foster that kept insisting, and he still insists now, that the agenda of the avant-garde should be kept separate and should be protected from all that trivialization. So I would imagine that Mr. Foster will not like a lot of the Biennales. Although he hasn't written on them at all. Let me repeat that last sentence. The universal exposition, the core form of capitalist cultural infrastructure conceived to be an alternative space in the first place, may be expected to literally corner the market on alternatives. And utopia, institutionalized in the city, as produced in the 19th century, may be expected to dazzle as it shields the powers that be. So because it is about alternatives already, the universal exposition, to this day, when you go to a World Expo, all the new things are there, all the changes are there, all the propositions to the world are there, all the arguments with the world are in the World Expos to this day. Therefore, to try and be separate from it and be a seriously critical person seems to be swallowed up by the idea that the whole thing is supposed to be about an alternative. But it is not. See, that's where it is too big for the individual. Okay. So, don't worry, this dense material is going to end soon. Today's international elite is distinguished more than anything else by the speed of their travel to absorb the world. It exists in the same rapid transit space that, sorry, I may be missing things. I am. Which was home to the 19th century cosmopolitans. You know the 19th century cosmopolitans, the Boulevardier, etc., etc. In both cases, their elite status and transnational resources are assured by a savoir-faire with communications technologies. It is disingenuous for this elite to appeal to geography-based cultural difference without reflecting on the hostility to difference, ordering their aesthetics of mobility and speed, to profit from the gains of radical art and activism, and to displace attention from themselves in the critique of power. I'm really, really hoping that I convey that sentence to you. There is an international elite, and they're very good at trading on radicalism and from averting our gaze from themselves as people who exercise tremendous power and to be outside criticism. Because everything that they present is an alternative. A strong contrary position is called for whenever blind spots are offered that may occlude the operations of power, including the power of organizing international art events. Hence, one takes exception to a suggestion offered by Okui and Bazor Okoy is a very famous curator. He was a curator of Documenta, the first African, the first non-European, I believe. And he comes out of Africa. Am I correct? He's the first non-European ever. Artistic director of Documenta 11, in connection with his earlier effort at the Johannesburg Biennale, which he said that such work should, quote-unquote, ultimately lead to a focus on the artworks themselves and not on the trials and problems of the people trying to organize these events. So Okoy said this, that you should focus on the artists and don't focus on the organization. I'm taking a different view. I'm taking the view that we focus on the organization and not on the artists, because the artists will have other venues where you can actually engage with them properly, I think. When I say that, I'd just like to say that I'm not suggesting that artists shouldn't participate. I'm just saying that the context for understanding their work is totally different from when they're in a gallery or in a museum or in a public space. All right. To point out that the trials and problems of the organizers are precisely the site to be watched most stringently and engaged by progressive critics is to press the progressive curators, and the Zor among them, to include selves in the criticism, in the critique of power. Okay. How artists maintain subtlety, let alone reflexivity, in the hothouse requires another extended discussion. However, participants in today's Crystal Palace events do understand or sense that a grave disjunction exists between the minutely layered, minutely differentiated spaces of radical contestation where it really hurts, and the colossal spaces celebrating the radical, where it really effervesces. The effervescence raises the temperature in the Crystal Palace, but one finds that the temperature must be so well calibrated that the experience is curiously pleasant, and the exotica on display is useful to the status quo. History, I end the 2006 essay with this paragraph. History, modern to postmodern, lies. Nagsisinungaling. Nagsisinungaling ang kasaysayan. It converts its readers to the arousals of change, where actually stasis is everywhere. It has, among other confidence tricks, promoted the construction of the last century and a half as a long time. Time in which change in the structures of domination has supposedly been well underway. Parang it's a long time ago. What is well underway is the work of radicalizing the understanding that things are not all right in the world. Such work benefits from the realization that the 19th century is not such a long time ago. The Crystal Palace exposition is inherent in a spatial order that, because it is architecturally imposed on Earth, in our being the modern bourgeois subject, or the postmodern one, or in the creation of our cities, does not disappear quickly. Certainly not to make room for descent beyond the confines of clearly marked hothouses. That's how I ended 2006. So here's what I wrote for, just to reflect back on that. I dredged up this old paper this year, not only because the word Biennale is on the tongues of artists in the Philippines and at least one senator of the land. This exhumation is for me to flog a dead horse, yet again. I have whipped this carcass before, actually. I flogged the dead horse, that is my own critique, knowing full well that there is no sense flogging a dead horse, and to do so anyway, outside all sense, common sense or otherwise, to release a whiff of its having existed, of my critique having existed. Operative word, therefore, is whiff. I find I have to be extremely precise, and the words necessary for precision are necessarily poetic. So let's stay within the word, let's stay with the word whiff, and let's calibrate its register. My interest today is to explore or limn the space available for what I believe criticism should attend to. That is the space I'm struggling to describe by picking up and picking on the word with. The space for that work of criticism is therefore evanescent. This is an essay that has disappeared into libraries, and people like me don't really care anymore whether it's read or not. The only reason I'm bending your ear this afternoon is to just say that I think there is a criticism that needs to be done, but there does not seem to be a space except for tiny things like this that end up in libraries, and I really don't know how it can circulate or can be of any use given the way things are transpiring. So I repeat that. I say the space, that space for criticism is therefore evanescent or ephemeral, possibly dead, possibly non-existent. But I certainly hope that there is a smell of it somewhere in our world. Crystal Palace exhibitions found that small evanescent space for proposing 5 things. So this is my summary for this afternoon. What I proposed in the past, and I'm still proposing now, but I know that the space for the proposition is probably not there. All right, I'll propose it anyway. 5. 1, the Biennales and other international art exhibitions exceed the capacity of old-fashioned art criticism. Art criticism cannot keep up with it. Number 2, geopolitical developments are the actual terrain of criticism of the appropriate scale. 3, the geopolitical shift from imperialism to empire obliges commentators and other engaged parties to think about the spaces for nuance. Number 4, the disjunct between artists and curators may be more profound than meets the eye. And number 5, if all of the above does not matter to anyone participating in these events, asymmetric power relations, I think, are sustained. But if everyone is fairly happy with the asymmetrical power relations, it'll be status quo. So, number 1, the Biennales and other international art exhibitions exceed the capacity of art criticism to respond to it. Simply put, there is no point in critically evaluating any artwork by any artist in any biennale, and here I use the word biennale as shorthand for other international art exhibitions, documenta included. Simply put, any such critical evaluation devaluates the writing into PR or art writing or some such, because the writing is entirely overwhelmed by the enormity of the context. Any discussion, for example, of the work of Jose Tense Ruiz, for instance, at the Venice Biennale, would seem to be puny effort, indeed in light of the complex universe of the Venice Biennale and its connections to the 19th century universal expositions. Any valuable evaluation, positive or negative or anything in between, of the artworks of Filipinos at Venice can only end one way, and it is this: artwork sustained the primacy of Venice as an unregurgitated art capital for the globe. The participation sustains the Biennale form as valid, although this effect overall does not need the Philippines. However, the more participants from all over the world who will not take up the Biennale as a context, however, the more participants from all over the world who will take up the Biennale as context will continue the status quo. Everyone will just be happy, but actually the real wielder of power is Venice. Not Italy, Venice. Number 2, geopolitical developments are the actual terrain of the criticism of the appropriate scale. If I said that art criticism will not match the situation, I mean, we can write about somebody's artwork, right? What's that? What's that in a big biennale with a 100-year history and with everything that's happening in the Mediterranean right now, etc., etc. All right, geopolitical developments. The Biennale has been analyzed in many circles as richly understood as competitions among cities. You know that. Venice, of course, did it in the Renaissance. It was making itself the city-state, and it did. It was the city-state that trumped all other city-states at that time. Presents itself as a capital city with nearly, it was not a nearly nation-state status, it was a nation-state. Because it can bring in national representation, into its courts. This template is still that of the Universal Exposition of the Imperial Days, but it slid seamlessly into the 21st century by art making and curation informed by post-colonial discourse. That's an irony. In this sense, post-colonial and indeed postmodern discourse is absorbed into and appropriated by a 19th century form, draining such discourse of blood, draining such discourse of edge, of penetrative capacity vis-a-vis Mandarin constructions of the global. In other words, you could be as critical as you want until you turn blue in the face in a biennale, and I still think that you are appropriated into the agenda of the city. You're a part of Venice's positioning in the world. Okay, thinking of the geopolitical landscape today, cities have emerged in many ways as bigger players than nations. However, I note that the biggest art capitals with the most power today still are not quite Biennale feverish. New York, Paris, Berlin, Los Angeles, London, Tokyo are not Biennale fever. The Biennales have been staged by Johannesburg, Havana, Guangzhou, Tirana, Singapore, a bunch in India, Dakar, all second, third, fourth tier cities who have rallied a will to mount a global platform, all based on one or another pivotal post-colonial moment. Guangzhou, as you know, mounted it because of the deaths of democracy activists. So serious moments have allowed cities like Guangzhou, for instance, which defines itself as a site for the struggles of democracy versus fascism, had been part of the Biennale creation of cities. Even Venice is not an economic capital today. It's deploying its only capital, which is the Biennale itself, which may have little to do with Italy's position in the scheme of things. Hence, it seems to me important to critique not the artworks, which merely play to the briefs, but the competitions among cities, not for the libertarian lines of flight opened up, and I'm using the word lines of flight in a delusion way, opened up by cultural politics, but in fact for unapologetic and unusually disingenuous use of cultural politics for city projection onto global importance, whether that importance is economic or merely symbolic of metaphysical ascendance. The rich area for criticism is located, I believe, where the motivations of each biennale are examined against 19th century economic and political ideologies, and to endeavor to expose or even detect the use of libertarian discourse, progressive discourse for city ambition. Each biennale for each city will have different coordinates. Each biennale for each city will have to be taken up as a mess of conflicting histories and rates of entropy. Each biennale for each city will need bifocal lenses that simultaneously sees, on one hand, slippages between talk and project intent, and on the other, slippages between and among art politics, which is internal to art, and political art, which is both internal and external to art, and politics and art, which is to talk of integrated systems within and without art. The plurality of vision and of the demand on the critical imagination may be quite extreme indeed, and may not allow for more than area specializations, I think. It may be too difficult to take it all on at this point in time. So number 3, let me repeat, the geopolitical shift from imperialism to empire obliges commentators and other engaged parties to be sensitive to minute change, not just dramatic shifts. Now, I am referring to a book entitled Empire by 2 men. Their names are Michael Hart and Anthony Negri. I believe Anthony Negri is still in jail in Italy. He's a Marxist activist. The word, actually, empire is a bit too romantic for me. It is romantic in a Marxist sense, but I do find it quite useful in the distinction it makes between imperialism and empire. And I'd like to share that with you right now so that we can move on into this little bit and go to the end of my paper. Imperialism is territorial. It has to do with taking your territory from you. Empire is not territorial, it's deterritorialized. we live in empire, inside empire. That's their position, which I find very useful. Meaning to say, there is no part of the world that's not inside the empire. There is no country that owns the empire. There is no location where the capital of the empire is. It's not New York, it's not Paris, it's not Berlin, it's not Shanghai or Beijing. Empire is the interconnectedness of the world, and you're inside it. Now, imperialism is actually to take territory. That's an old thing. It doesn't happen anymore. People might be fighting for the Spratlys, but as a matter of fact, I think maybe if we begin to think in terms of empire, that everybody is inside, there is no outside position. You are involved in everything that's happening. The prices of oil in Saudi Arabia is going to make 10,000 Filipinos come home. So it's not as though things are disconnected. Everything is connected inside what Negri and Hart call empire. So how do you resist? How do you mount resistance within empire if everything is interconnected and you are inside it? You don't have a soapbox to be outside it. They are suggesting that the phenomena of Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Seattle, which is a global resistance based on internet, and it can occur anywhere on the planet, might be the nature of resistance within empire, not the old imperialism. So if we are inside empire, the case of the city-state Singapore seems to me an appropriate site of inquiry in this connection. A few observations may be enumerated. The state has, in no uncertain terms, decided to be and expressed the will to be the cultural capital of this part of the world, to match its status as economic capital hereabouts. In a way, the expressions of this will can be described as modern, and I use modern to say dated, in the sense that there are no reservations, no qualifications about the right of capital to assume to mount cultural platforms. And can be described as old-fashioned capitalism in the sense that the cultural capital accumulated in Singapore is actually tradable commodity to be exchanged. In other words, of the Singapore National Museum, etc., and its vast collection of Southeast Asian art, which they just opened. I haven't seen it. I'll actually see it tomorrow. Singapore has no qualms about arrogating any status unto itself because of concomitant moral superiority. All of you other guys in Southeast Asia are not as prestigious, and you're all lazy. It assumes it because of its wealth and order. So Singapore has been, for the last 15 years, trying to arrogate unto itself, the power to write Southeast Asian art. They've done it. May I announce to you they have done it, okay? They have done it because they are morally superior to us. They have done it because they have the money to do so, and they have done it because they can collect anything they want to collect. All right. But this is the part where I would like to insist that I'm not your East versus West sort of writer or thinker. The challenge of Singapore to would-be critics of Biennales and other such events is to do with recognizing that capital does not act the way it did in the late unlamented modern world. Its capital is not territorialized as it was in the days of Wall Street. The city-state of Singapore is not a territory the way the United Kingdom was a territorial imperium in the 19th century. An empire is different from Singapore, even if they like to pretend that they can. But it is rather a lively node in a planetary network of an abstract financial reality. Hence, when it reveals its collection of Southeast Asian art in the newly opened National Art Gallery, which takes its turn after consecutive Singapore Biennales as consolidating moment for cultural capital, the idea that Singapore is enacting a late blooming imperialist mission is probably wrong. I am not going to endorse a position or subscribe or express a position that Singapore is wrong because it is acting like a 19th century capitalist. There is no such thing. We really have to think about this in another way. We really have to think about our collusion in Singapore. Everybody colluded with Singapore. Everybody made some money off Singapore. Everyone in Southeast Asia. So we can't actually say we're outside it. Yielding to Singapore will be to describe art, yielding to Singaporean will to describe or inscribe art in Southeast Asia, or resisting or proposing alternative views is not going to be assisted by anti-capitalist, anti-imperial diatribe. It will only be assisted by understanding the flows of capital in a deterritorialized empire where there is no capital. Number 4, the disjunct between artists and curators may be more profound than meets the eye. Let me detour to 2000, when was this? I forget now, Dakar, Senegal, where I was brought by the Mondrian Foundation of the Netherlands to observe and conduct the implementation of their Biennale for future funding. It was clear to me that the artists, mostly from Senegal, but from the French-speaking part of Africa, were robustly taken up by anti-colonial imaginary. So the artists were into anti-colonialism, kind of in hindsight. It was their thing. A lot of it was quite engaging. The Dakar Biennale, however, pitched itself, the Biennale itself, as past the rhetoric of the early 1990s Johannesburg Biennale. In other words, this is way after the Johannesburg Biennale. So it was not really, as a whole, it was not being pitched as an anti-colonial, because the anti-colonial discussion has been happening since, Senegal, very famous. All right, so what I'm saying is that the curatorial brief didn't seem to match what the artists were doing. And I can't say on any ethical position that the artists were not up to date, the artists were not sophisticated. The artists were not sophisticated because they didn't know how to move on from the Johannesburg Biennale. The curators have a different agenda, and the agenda is not necessarily the same as the city of Dakar, or the country of Senegal, or the state or France, which is funding the Dakar Biennale, or the Mondrian Foundation of the Netherlands, which is also funding the Dakar Biennale. All of these positionings, and I'm not saying they're bad positionings, I'm just saying they have to be understood. Because otherwise we're all very naive. All right. I have a little bit here about Durban in South Africa, but I'll skip that. I'll go to the end. Number 5, if all of the above does not matter to any participants because it's all fun. How do we say that? It's more fun in the Biennales. Asymmetric power relations are sustained. I'd like to end this paper by a couple of qualifications. This paper has not proposed that artists' efforts are so small, so puny, that critical regard is pointless. That is not what I'm suggesting. This paper does not suggest that only the macro view should matter. For me, however, having seen having seen Shirin Neshat in Documenta 11 was quite a moment for me. And so you can have encounters that can profoundly move you and change your life forever. I mean, for me, seeing the work of Shirin Neshat in Documenta was profound. But I reminded myself even then that the Friedrichshanum in Kassel, I'm speaking to that man over there, to never keep at the back of my head, to put it always forward in my mind, the history of Documenta in the context of the Second World War, after the Second World War, and what Joseph Beuys was trying to do in Kassel. It's a particular history, it's a particular set of significations, it's a particular set of coordinates. And while I had so much fun looking at the artworks and I felt that I was engaged with the artists, you have to be engaged with Kassel. You have to be engaged with Kassel. You have to be engaged with the Second World War. You have to be engaged with Germany after the Holocaust, and how you move from there. We have to know about all of this if you want to do, I think, critical, well, to me, what is rich area for criticism? We know enough about art systems within larger systems not to be comfortable with the delusion that art making can speak internally to art only. And in saying this, I go back to my word, a whiff. If there's a smell of this critique somewhere in time, I'd be happy with that, because I do know that perhaps the space for that criticism may not be existing right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Marian. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or response?
Okay, go home. I want to go home now.
I've been living under a rock because I guess I didn't realize there were Biennales anywhere but Venice. So you've illuminated me today.
Thank you.
Sorry, maybe I was too busy working. But
As an architect, by the way.
as an architect, yes. Both office buildings and Wizarding World Ferry Plotter. But anyway.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a, I think it's always a pleasure to listen to Marian give a talk in whatever subject. So I thought it was, I always like it anyhow. I think it's very interesting to have it on the Biennale, especially because of the recently, well, the furor and the actual event of the Biennale. And you mentioned about, of course, how the Biennale is basically, well, it's a map.
It's a map.
And the positioning of, the more artists or countries decide to be part of this map, the more power Venice has.
Yeah.
Because it just sort of feeds into the entire idea of what Venice is. No? So how would you, maybe this is a silly question, but how would you position the persistence of countries around the world, basically, who want to continue trying to figure out their positioning or their inclusion in that map in Venice? And the
desire is really big.
Yeah, it's so huge, and there's a gravitational pull towards Venice all the time, because that is, of course, the Biennale, and there, of course, vis-a-vis that is Documenta, which is not,
or Havana,
which are not Biennales in the sense that Venice is. Especially, I think Documenta, because as you mentioned, and I think a lot of people sort of dump Documenta as a Biennale of the same.
Yes, I was hoping that I didn't actually make you think that way. Yes, actually didn't. So I'm grateful for the question.
So,
Why? Why the desire, right? Is that the question?
Yes.
I think I painted out Venice as the most conservative. It's the oldest. It's the most conservative of all the Biennales, and it's quite unapologetically European. It's never had a non-European curator. Oh, Okui, that's right. No, Okui was Documenta. Now, yes, today, yeah, right now, this year. Because it is conservative, it is understandable. What do I mean by conservative? All the people, you can have a Senator Laurent Legarda who knows next to nothing about art to get excited by it. So if you can get a Laurent Legarda excited by something she doesn't understand, then that means that the powers that be can release money. It is conservative enough for Laurent Legardas of every country to open faucets of money. So because of that, then it just churns itself into a frenzy by itself. And I really think that Venice does not really make any apologies for what it is. It is directly linked to the world expositions because the formulation is country pavilions. So the other Biennales have been trying their darndest not to slot into Miss Universe beauty pageant, di ba? Miss Colombia, Miss Venezuela. That is actually the formulation of the World Expo and Disneyland and Venice. So it is easy to grasp. It is easy for, okay, I made the point, but it's easy to grasp. But the second point to be made is that it is also easy to enter because you just have to be important in your country. You have to kind of be accepted as serious because Venice is going to pretty much accept what a country provide. It's a country pavilion. So it's like the World Expo. Whatever you put in your pavilion is, hey, you know, as long as it kind of fits the general thematic of the, all right. So in a way, Venice is easy. Now, Documenta is not easy because you get invited to Documenta and it doesn't matter what country you belong to. So that's the distinct difference of Documenta. It is absolutely curated. And if they don't have, you know, if they end up in 5 countries, they will not apologize for it also. Meaning to say they don't have to represent the world. They don't have to represent you just because you exist as the Philippines. I mean, there has been like 2 people in Documenta from the Philippines in its entire history. No one has been invited, as a matter of fact. And I think Manuel Ocampo was kind of on the side also. All right. Now, if you're talking about Havana, which has made itself the alternative biennale for you know, people who are not countries that are not in the transit, in the axis of the rich. Havana has created its own counter discourse. You're aware of that. I do not know where it's going because Havana, Cuba is changing. And its old positioning as the avenue, the channel for South American art into the world, into New York, as a matter of fact. Because Havana has played that role. It has pitched itself differently from Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is like Venice. It's old-fashioned. It could very well be in the 19th century. But Havana has this, it belongs to a moment of post-colonial critique of imperialism. So it was 1970s, it was the time of Wilfredo Lam. So these are different things, which just makes me go back to my point, which is that each one of them has to be understood differently in terms of competitions of cities. In fact, in terms of what Havana is to the rest of Cuba, what Havana is to Mexico, what Havana is to Latin America. These are all very dense coordinates. But for Venice, if you are not very aware of the working criticism that's been happening in the past 50 years, then Venice is very exciting. There's a certain innocence about it, yes. But, like I always take care to do, I always take care not to say, oh, it's imperialism. There is no more imperialism, it's all empire. Yeah. All right, we're going to talk.
All right. Well, then how would you, you talked about the idea that radicalism already exists as part of the idea of the World Expos.
Even in 1851,
Exactly,
it was the alternative.
yeah. It already was an alternative. Then how do we actually create this lacunae that you talk about to enter and make critique and
Possible.
if we are already all part of empire?
This is the reason I find empire useful, because I think it begins with acknowledgement that you don't have a soapbox outside. You cannot say ibagsak. You can't. That's not possible anymore. Strategically, it's ridiculous to say you're wrong. You are capitalismo, etc., etc. I mean, this is all quite romantic Marxism. I think Marxism should be updated. I mean, it is updated. I think the rhetoric should be informed by at least Althusserian Marxism. But all I'm saying is, It begins with the understanding that you don't have a soapbox outside the empire. You're inside it, you're in collusion with it, and you have to ask what your, how you're imbricated in everything. What are your basic, for example, Singapore. Let's take Singapore as an example. So Singapore, as we know, has done what it said it will do. It will write Southeast Asian art. You finish, tapos. It's done it. They have all the art. They have all the manuscripts. No, manuscripts are with Hong Kong. So there's a kind of a different, yeah, okay. But no one can actually say, down with Singapore. There's no such thing. You can't say, oh my God, they got all our art. They get to write about it. They get to do the legitimizing processes. They get to exhibit things that you can't exhibit in the Philippines or in Indonesia or in Myanmar or Vietnam. How do you position yourself? How do you create a critique of that? I think you create a critique of that, but understanding that we made money off Singapore. We got grants. We were in collusion with it. We accepted its cultural superiority because it was rich. So I think it begins with our understanding of our position in the scheme of things. And I like the idea of occupying. Perhaps. There's a question over there.
Hi, Marian.
Hi, hello.
I just wanted to find out, was that the project for you when because you've been a very consistent critic of the exposition model, but you have chosen to participate.
Yes. Yes.
So could you tell us a little bit about
My participation.
yes, what you were hoping to do, for instance, in DC and maybe the other one in China?
Yeah.
If you
What Eileen is referring to is that I actually curated World Expos, Philippine pavilions in the World Expos, 3 of them, one after the other. So I did the Philippine pavilion in Aichi, in Zaragoza, Spain, and in Shanghai. What was I trying to do there? It's a really, really confronting question, even if I ask it of myself each time around, because every time it's different. I will go back to what I said about you have to know the coordinates of each place. With Aichi, the Bureau of International Expositions was already rethinking whether there should be world expositions or not. The BIE is the world body sitting in Paris that gives the permit. It's like the Olympics. You go hold yours on this date. All right. At that time, in 2006, there was talk in BIE that there will be no more World Expos because it has run its course. At that time, Japan made a bid to say that it has not run its course. Japan said you can use it as a platform. There was a discourse of the catastrophic, that the world is in trouble, and maybe if you really have this every 4 years meeting of people, that you might find a space for addressing common problems, not problems of each and every country. So the Japan exposition was about nature, and that was the first time that NGOs were given a pavilion in a World Expo. Now, I'm not suggesting it by any means that I find it nice and utopian all over again. Because as you know, all of our utopian imaginations tend to become dystopic. So, what did I try to do there for the Philippines? A country that I have no intellectual investments in. Let me just clarify this. I have no intellectual investments or emotional investments in the nation, but I have emotional and intellectual investments in certain groups of people inside this thing called the Philippines. of which I'm I'm very passionate about. So I thought that for the groups of people that I care most passionately about, who happen to be called Filipinos, I was given an opportunity to stage them in an expo that is trying to recreate expos. So as you can imagine, you cannot be innocent, you cannot be naive, but you try to find a place in it. It was before Occupy, but I was kind of trying to see if there's any space there. Did I find space there? Ito lang. Curatorially, I decided to focus on the non-spectacular. I tried to construct a discourse of the non-spectacular in a spectacular scenario. The whole thing, expos are about spectacle. So I exhibited the smallest things from the Philippines where you need a magnifying glass. I didn't think it was provocative. The Japanese really like to use magnifying glass to look at really tiny things. The pavilion was quite empty. So those are the things that I do. I'm happy you asked this question because I've never publicly said anything about what I tried to do. In Zaragoza, it was even harder because when I got the brief, it said the country should present its ideas about water and the sustainability of water. And there was going to be a major forum on water and a Zaragoza letter that asked the world to conserve water. So the whole thing was about water. Now, if at that time, 2008, until now, maybe yes, a little bit now, there was no national policy on water. We waste water. We have been very bad with water. If you look at the national, you will not find anything that you can present to the world as something that you did. And like I kept saying to the organizers here, I'm a curator, I'm not a spin doctor. I have to kind of have a kernel of something to work with. So if there is no national policy on water, if there was no, at that time, nothing that you can say that the nation construct was doing about water, what on earth can you actually present? What I decided to do after fooling around with ideas for a while is to not look at the nation, the national, the government. I looked at the islands, and if you put your eye downwards and see what people are doing on the ground, you will in fact find thousands of projects on water conservation. Thousands, all by little NGOs, all by people that you don't know. Everybody is doing a little bit of something, and none of them, as a matter of fact, were new. I mean, for instance, the Panglao Sanctuary is like 30 years old. The seagrass conservation project in Bolinao, Pangasinan is 30 years old. The marine ecosystems of Apo Reef, the one of Dr. Alcala, that was when Dr. Alcala was young. This had been sustained. It was only destroyed in Yolanda. So if you really look at what people are doing in the Philippines, there's like really an archipelago of efforts. So I decided to mount a World Expo pavilion of the Philippines based on what little people are doing anonymously. And we won the best designed pavilion on earth. So I'm kind of happy for moments like that, but the ambassador of the Philippines to Spain hated it and told me that he really did not think that it was appropriate. But for some reason, I managed to mount the damn thing. So that's what I do. I don't really have a lot of fun. But I think that as a result of the research that I did for Zaragoza, I actually know everybody that's doing water conservation. And in my other work as a policy advisor, I am actually able to name each and every one of those 1,000 water conservation efforts. I know them intimately, and when I do policy work, it goes in. So it's a laboratory. Most of the time I fail, as I've said often. Okay, I can go home.
Other questions or comments? And she has also mentioned that, she has all of her essays are written, so if you want to revisit, I encourage you to do so. You know where to find it in the library, online, and you can buy also.
No, this book is not online. The one
Where do they get if they want to revisit your essay?
This one, Crystal Palace Exhibitions, it was published twice, like I said. It's MIT Press, so if you could just log on to MIT Press, the name of the book is over here. Jean Fisher and Gerardo Mosquera, and then Bergen Kunsthal in Norway. Unfortunately, I have only a copy, so you can Xerox. It's not online. Sorry. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much, and we'd like to encourage you to visit all the other museums and exhibitions that where Miss Marian's team and her work is seen. And we'd also like to invite you to come to the opening of MCAD's upcoming exhibition on the 18th of February. Sorry. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone.